So, back on the topic of ne'emanut, we have quite a discussion to be had about the ne'emanut, about the trustworthiness or the believability of non-Jews when it comes to kashrut. If the world were only composed of Jews, maybe kashrut would be in some ways easier, in some ways harder. What are you going to do that the overwhelming majority of everyone who works in the food industry happens not to be Jewish? In Israel, it's for the most part Arabs. Here in the U.S., it's immigrants of all kinds that work in these slaughterhouses, factories, processing plants, etc. So there are items, and we'll definitely need to break this down and discuss this. There are items that don't require hashgacha, which means there is no reason to suspect that non-Jews would have adulterated or contaminated the product with anything even potentially non-kosher. Was that?
Mineral water.
Mineral water, yeah. Well, there's no money to be made in certifying that a product doesn't need certification, right?
Correct.
Classic story. Feel free to tell your friends. I'll tell you if you want off record. The rabbi who told it to me gets a call from a place in the Midwest. It says, "Hi, Rabbi so-and-so from such and such kosher organization. We were told that you're the one in charge of industrial and chemical applications, and we've got an interesting business proposition. We want to start making kosher dish soap, the detergent." So the rabbi said, "I don't mean to break your hearts, but detergent doesn't really require kashrut." And like, "No, we know, Rabbi. Thank you. We would just like anyway to produce one with it because we decided, they studied the market, they did a feasibility study, they found out there are a lot of people who responded positively to it, and so this was their gimmick, and apparently it went on like it happened. They made." I'm sure there's more than one actually that has a.
Well, every dishwashing soap has oil on it. Or
I'm sorry. This was
okay or whatever.
Laundry detergent.
Oh, the
Was
Tide
the
has
soap
one,
Yes.
and a few others.
I don't think Tide was the one in question. I think they've had it for a while.
There are a few of them. Ridiculous.
So
Well, here's the joke: is that they don't even
clothes.
you don't even send anyone to supervise it. What's that?
So you can eat your clothes. Your kids can eat their clothes. It'll be fine.
The people in the park. Yeah, the world's full of all kinds of interesting types. The question is if. Right. So I could probably eat my clothes even if the detergent was made from pig fat or something. There are some interesting discussions to be had here. So first of all, not every item requires hashgacha on it. That's a question in and of itself. Where do we draw the line? What counts, what doesn't count, etc. Maybe more relevant is that the items that do require hashgacha, how much hashgacha do they require? In other words, how do I know that the cheese in the package that I bought that has a sticker that says it was produced under such and such hashgacha? By the way, I don't know what it is with cheeses. It seems like every new hashgacha decides to get into cheeses before they do anything else. Every time someone comes and says to me, "I've seen a new hashgacha I've never seen before, it's on a cheese." Don't ask me why. For some reason it's not meat, it's not pharmaceuticals, it's not vitamin supplements. Cheese. Okay. So, how do I know once an item left the Jewish store or factory, or once the mashgiach left, that the food in the establishment continues to be kosher? An interesting discussion. The Gemara says specifically their greatest suspicion was by meat. This is what's called the basar shenit'alem min ha'ayn. Literally, it's meat that disappeared from view. Literally disappeared from the eye. If I'm in a slaughterhouse and I'm slaughtering goats, and one of the goats is kosher and one of them is not, and we're cutting them into pieces, once I lose my line of sight, once I lose my visible contact with the kosher goat, and I can no longer identify it as kosher, I now have a serious suspicion on my hands. What if the kosher meat got mixed up with the non-kosher meat? And then we have many complicated halakhot. These are the most complicated tests in the rabbanut for like regular rabbinic ordination in Israel. Isur v'heter. What do you do if you have a piece of kosher meat, a piece of non-kosher meat? What proportion, the likelihood, the probabilities, etc. Okay. Under what circumstances, or at what point is the mashgiach allowed not to be there during every single second of production? Or for that matter, how many mashgichim do I have to have in order to make sure there's someone with his eyes on the product at all points along the way? Does a mashgiach ever go to the bathroom? Maybe he's par'o and he doesn't need to. But outside of this, is it possible the mashgiach, forget, God forbid, that he has a cell phone and that he gets a call every so often, he's to step out and take it? What if he's late or has to leave early? What if he has to do something in the middle of the day and he can't be there for whatever reason? So we have a Talmudic precedent for the concept of a mashgiach, what's called nichnas v'yotzei. He doesn't need to be there on the spot, on top of everything all the time. It's sufficient in some cases that he come and go. And this because the fact, we'll go back to this concept of the Shekhinah, this great fear, right? You have this fear the mashgiach might show up. And this fear has to be predicated on something else, which is not very often quoted in the context of such a discussion, and that is that the goy, the non-Jew, has something to lose by trying to counterfeit product or to contaminate it, right? So the expression of the Gemara is there is a chazakah, there is an established assumption that an otherwise reputable non-Jew would like to maintain a good reputation. Which is interesting, because if you're dealing with someone who's not reputable or couldn't care less, these are the kinds of people you have to be careful about. And perhaps no degree of hashgacha is enough. When it comes to someone, so let's say you have a non-Jewish producer of a certain product and has a factory or a plant where they produce certain things. If the plant itself, if their reputation would be damaged because they violated some concept of kashrut, we're going to politely rely on their care about their reputation in order to relieve the mashgiach of at least some of his duties, or at least some of the time he otherwise have to be there. In other words, harken back to the discussion that we had about a year ago on the topic of Chalev Yisrael. What did Rav Moshe Feinstein base this discussion of Chalev Yisrael on when it came to America and the way things were done here as opposed to the way they were done in Europe? The whole concept is built on what? The foundation of this discussion?
Fear of the FDA, USDA.
Fear of the secular authorities, right? FDA, USDA, whatever. In this case, probably the USDA. Who is it that oversees this particular industry? Are there punishments in place for people who violate? Do they in fact punish for these violations? By the way, remember this concept of the Sheva Mitzvot B'nai Noach, the 7 Noachide commandments. Well, one of these commandments is that they have to have not only a judicial system, but they actually have to have officers of the judicial system, executioners in the case of capital punishment, people who administer corporal punishment or fines, penalties. In other words, it's not enough to comply with Torah law if there's a non-Jewish society living in Israel. Let's say the Arabs wanted to live there. And they want to live there, and they're okay with accepting the fact that it's a Jewish state. Pure theoretical question. In the event that they wanted to continue to live in Israel under the, let's say Halakhah, then it wouldn't be enough that they have laws on the books, like adultery and incest are forbidden, theft and murder are forbidden. They would actually have to prosecute these crimes, otherwise the laws are meaningless. So in keeping with the same, and incidentally, just so you know, this is how Or HaChaim HaKadosh proves, he vindicates Shimon Levi, who destroyed the entire city of Shechem. He explains, and he comes out shooting, saying the entire city deserved to be destroyed. Why is this? Because they had no such thing as a prosecutable offense. Shechem was a prince, he can do whatever he wants. Imagine that. A society in which the ruling party or the politicians can make laws but don't have to obey them. It's spiritually nauseating. So he says, yeah, if you have a society in which some people are obligated by the laws and some aren't, and some people are exempt because of their importance or their prominence or their wealth, etc.
But the fact that the communities follow one of the shells of the law
means they're executed.
or
That's the Gemara. Violating any one of these 7 precepts is executable. Yes, capital punishment. So it's absolutely meaningless that you have laws on the books that you don't enforce. The Gemara says this, right? A law that's not enforced is not a law. When we say dina d'malchuta dina, the laws of the land in which you live are the laws. Meaning, halachically speaking, yes, you're bound by the speed limit. It's a violation of halakha. You're creating somewhat of a disgrace if you choose to exempt yourself from these laws. At the same time, if there's a law in the books that no one obeys or no one abides by, it's just not a law. They themselves don't punish each other for this. It's So if they punish a Jew for doing it, it's effectively discrimination. Why would a Jew be the only one who gets punished for doing certain things? So Rav Moshe Feinstein's psak, and he wasn't the first one who came up with this idea, was predicated on there being, contingent upon there being a system not only of occasional checks, but a system that actually catches people who violate the law and that punishes them. This creates the halakhic disincentive for someone to adulterate or contaminate the product, even when the mashgiach isn't there. And in fact, this is the basis of inspections in general. You should know. Even in a USDA facility, I can tell you from my experience, the inspector is not always there. So usually if it's a big place, there's more than one person, someone covers for someone, but they can't see everything all the time. The fact of the matter is you have recalls anyway. So what they're doing is they're effectively basing things on they align the interests. It's in your best interest not to have a product recalled. We're going to ensure that you're following sanitary procedures. In the event that you violate them, even if the law doesn't punish you, at least there are enough laws on the books that allow for ambulance-chasing lawyers to destroy you and to take away your business. So there's a certain fear factor. One way or the other, there is such a thing. You can be sued for violating these concepts. You can be penalized by the state, financial disincentive for doing it. So when it comes to Halakhah, the Gemara bases this on the non-Jew's desire to maintain his reputability, his good reputation. And so even if I don't have a mashgiach there all the time, it's enough that the mashgiach come on occasion in order to what? In order to maintain the fear. And once the fear no longer exists, which by the way is really one of the more legitimate gripes that some hashgachot have against others. When you hear about these political discussions and who's accepts who and who not, there are places that are much more laid back. And they're so laid back that sometimes the hashgachah becomes a joke, because really they can do whatever they want if they know that the mashgiach comes once a year, and once a year is pretty infrequent. In fact, you don't have to be a genius to say, well, if he's Jewish, he's probably busy around the holidays. If I wanted to cheat, it's really hard for him to find the time to come and inspect and make sure.
All those stores open on Shabbat with
yeah, it's a sticky issue, Shabbat. Incidentally, I received a request recently that we should talk about this whole concept of work on Shabbat, partnerships with Goyim, what's permissible, what's not. I get a lot of questions about this. So if the mashgiach is so distant that there's no chance he's going to show up, and even if I did cheat, he probably wouldn't catch me, what's the hashgacha worth? Effectively, you're doing nothing. It's a law that's not enforced, and it's something that I have no reason, I have no incentive to abide by. So then what you have is not a halakha, and then what you have is a case-by-case basis. Look, halakha is very hard to work out that way. I can tell you, want a funny story about this? In Morocco, the Basani had a shochet that he used to request. He would request his services when he wanted chickens or lambs, whatever it was. So his shochet was once sick, and the Basani asked him for, I don't remember what it was, a number of chickens, and the shochet was sick. So he said, without them being able to communicate, he said, okay, I'm just going to send one of my talmidim instead to do the shechita for him. The Basani had a Muslim servant that was going to go pick these things up. So the Arab comes back from the shechita and says, I have to tell you honestly, I don't think this guy is as careful as the other one. He said he was a little bit quick, he didn't check as conscientiously, I think he was more excited to get it done and then move on. So and he relied on this, and he said, send the chickens back, I'll wait until the other guy feels better, and I'll have chicken then. So there are goyim who have tremendous reliability and dependability, and there are those that don't so much have. For that matter, what's the status of a Jew who is not observant, or not so halakhically conscientious? Is it for any intents and purposes any different than the status of a non-Jew? People get offended when you hear things like this. The old halakhic benchmark was Shabbat observance. If you don't observe Shabbat, and here maybe it's even more specifically if you violate Shabbat in public. See, I don't know if you're smoking cigarettes in the privacy of your own apartment. I don't know that I have an obligation to go check. But if you violate Shabbat in public, like if you get on a bus and go to the beach, then your halakhic believability is effectively that of a non-Jew. The Shulchan Aruch reads this way. It's entirely possible that someone who disbelieves in the Shabbat, someone who does not accept the concept that the world being created in 6 days, Hashem is ceasing to create on the 7th and expecting us to do the same, the concept doesn't register. So if that's the case, that used to be the standard. For edut, for testimony, if you want to sign a ketubah, sign a get. For kashrut purposes, are you reliable enough? So there are non-Jews who aren't obligated in the Shabbat. Generally speaking, we relate a little bit differently to the testimony of non-Jews. But here's a gem, right out of the Gemara Masechet Chulim. The Gemara says like this. Let's say I'm in a kitchen. Okay, cooking situation. I can't afford to hire only Jews. I have some non-Jews working in the kitchen. A piece of cheese or a little bit of milk happens to fall into a big tmecha that I'm making of some meat product. And so what does the Gemara say? It's effectively, 1 portion to 60. What if I didn't have a scale, or if the piece fell in before I could estimate how big it was? So I had one of my guys cutting up 1,000 cubes of cheese. One of them fell into a pot in which I was cooking some meat. If I could sit there, every situation in life, if only life was in a laboratory, right? So before he knocks the piece of cheese into the pot, I say, wait a second, Jorge, do me a favor. Get out a scale. Tell me exactly how much this piece of cheese weighs. Let's calculate how many cubes of meat I put in with the exact... He'll tell you, a piece of cheese fell in. It was an accident. Now what do I do that I can't ascertain that it was 1 to 60 or less? I'm stuck. Dawid suggests, we'll just taste it. If it tastes like milk, don't eat it. Or don't eat when anyone's looking. If it tastes like meat with no trace of dairy product, then probably it's okay. Do I have the right to taste it in such a situation? If it's asur, it's asur. If it's mutar, it's mutar. How do I know? I don't know. So the Gemara says, what do you do in a situation like this?
You ask Jorge.
Well, no, Jorge is the guy, his job is on the line. He's the last guy I can ask about this. He's going to tell me, no, it tastes perfect, forget about it. The cheese, it's as if it wasn't even there. He knows that he has an interest in answering the question, therefore the Gemara says, he's not the guy I can ask. What do I have to do? I have to ask a kfila or rama'a. I have to ask a non-Jewish chef. Why a chef specifically? Someone who can discern, someone who's sensitive to it. And even this, the poskim say, the chef in question is believed when he's mesiach lefi tumo. This is a classic halachic concept. Mesiach lefi tumo. Sicha in Hebrew means a discussion. Mesiach lefi tumo means he's speaking innocently. Like he doesn't know what the story is. So if I were to tell him, listen, I happen to have a guy in my kitchen who's about to be decapitated. If you can perceive even the slightest trace of dairy product in this dish, the guy's already starting to think. If I tell him, taste this, tell me if you can pick up on the secret ingredient. Okay, what's in my soup? What's in my stew? My ratatouille or my ragu? I can say, okay, let me think, let me see. I can pick up this, I can pick up that. A little bit of thyme, a little bit of rosemary, a little bit of red wine. It's a nice meat dish. If he himself tells me innocently, I don't taste any dairy, so guess what? It says, well, you're entitled to go ahead and eat from this item. The Gemara says the same thing, incidentally, by terumah. What happens if I'm cooking something, let's say I'm making a stew, and accidentally some of the barley that I had set aside to give to a kohen as terumah ends up getting knocked into the pot. So here it's not a question of kosher, non-kosher, meaning it's a surah to eat from the terumah if you're not a kohen, or
And if you have taste, it's going to be the same.
so maybe if it were possible to identify, either you can taste it or you can't, the Gemara says the only way to resolve a situation like this, let a kohen taste it. If it's terumah, you can eat it. If it's not, then you can. Fine. So I can have someone who's permitted to eat from this admixture solve the problem for me. But this, says the Gemara, on the condition that he or she be speaking relatively innocently, and apparently they have to have some kind of understanding. The Rishonim, there's a machloket about this. Does it have to be a chef, or can it be someone relatively normal? In other words, when the Torah forbids me to eat milk and meat, it only forbids it for the average normal person. What if someone's hypersensitive? Better yet, what if somebody's allergic? Great Facebook conversation I've had a couple of weeks ago. Someone writes, I don't understand. Oreo cookies. They say OUD, but there aren't any dairy ingredients in them. So 1,000 women get involved in it. So my wife says, okay, this is an easy question. The equipment is dairy, but the cookie is not. And because you can't taste anything dairy in the cookie itself is part of it. Oh, it says OUD, but really it's part of it. You just probably shouldn't eat it along with meat. You can eat it right afterwards. All these women come out and, what are you talking about? What do you know? What are you this? What are you that? This is that? How can you say something? It says OUD on the package. It's OUD on the package. It's a simplistic way of looking at things. The reality is this cookie is part of it. Why are you attacking women who eat this cookie after meat meals or doing anything wrong? This one woman made this a holy war, starts yelling, fighting, screaming, okay, fine. I said, so she asked me this question. I wrote a long answer explaining halachically why, and this is for regular Oreos, right? The black and white ones. Peanut butter and mint, they have dairy ingredients in them. I wrote a long answer saying, this is the case. It still wasn't good enough. I said, okay, I called the OU. Totally innocent, right? Hi, how are you doing? I'm a student in Yeshiva Day School. I just want to know if it's okay if I eat some Oreo cookies after I have a hamburger. So the woman answered the phone, had this whole network database in front of her, and she says, yes, it's okay. The regular black and white Oreo cookies are really part of it. So why do you write that they're dairy? I said, well, it's only so as not to confuse the mashgichim who work on the line. That's essentially. And they write on the cookie itself, on the packaging, that it may contain traces of milk. Why may contain traces of milk? Say, but oh, you can see clearly you're wrong. It says it may contain traces of milk. Halakhah doesn't forbid traces of milk. Why do they write that? They write that because people who are allergic might have a reaction.
But it's still less.
It's in
than
parts
1 to
per
16.
billion, but they might have a reaction. Someone's going to have a reaction, so legally speaking, I cover myself. It's a fig leaf, as they say, right?
So you're
Referring back
saying
to Dama Chala.
they're just too late. Not the OU specifically, but I don't think. I think it's been years that I haven't seen any Kashrut organization that makes the difference between dairy and dairy equipment.
There are a few. The good ones.
Like, it's just out of laziness.
So yes, I would say it's out of laziness because our job in Halakhah is to teach people Halakhah, not to make everything asur, to make life more comfortable for us. So, okay, but tell it to the rest of the world. So, long story short, was that this woman went down kicking and screaming and she absolutely refused. So I said, okay, here's the number for the OU, call them yourselves. But they themselves said it was dairy. I know, call them up and I'll tell you what's not. I don't want to hear it. It's like, okay, fine. So, you don't want to hear it, you don't want to hear it. Halakhah is this way. It's not a question of parts per million or parts per billion. It's not a question of someone super. So what if somebody's allergic, and they can taste the milk and or they're allergic to the milk? By the way, my wife pointed out, she sent a picture on this chain of responses that Elite's part of dark chocolate also happens to say on it that it may contain traces of milk. But it says part on it.
Yeah, there was a
So I say five on it because some kid is allergic, is going to freak out.
There was a debate in France about one specific chocolate, and there was a supervision of the system that has like the same thing, making them traces of milk, with bow or not.
So traces were not considered. That's right.
People
People are allergic.
like it's this bar. They were considered this bar. They were
She probably just created another badatz that's in the high. See, they don't know what they're doing. We do. So this is the way these situations are going to work out. If the non-Jew is innocent and doesn't have a vested interest in the product, we might be inclined to believe. If it's someone who has a vested interest in the product, or vested interest in perhaps contaminating or diluting the product with something non-kosher, then it becomes more of a challenge. Just understand that we don't say this by Jews who are observant. There is no halachic reason to suspect someone who's observant of not being believable and not being trustworthy. The whole concept of the Mashgiach, in fact, appears only in the context of non-Jews or Jews who are incompetent. So, for example, someone who doesn't observe the Shabbat, this is a pretty big chidush. Or someone who maybe eats non-kosher meats on occasion. If there's a Mashgiach standing over him, his shechita is still kosher. If I can stand there and I can see that the knife was properly prepared, the shechita was properly effectuated, the guy becomes almost irrelevant. Now you're depending on me, you're not depending on him. Does a shochet who knows what he's doing need someone over him? The answer is no. This is clear from the first chapter of the Churin. Why is this? I don't have suspicions of this person. And yes, even though he may be selling his own meat, this is how the Gemara explains it. When you have someone who's trustworthy, that's not the ideal. When do you need a mashgiach? When the person that you're dealing with is not trustworthy, either because they don't observe the mitzvot or couldn't care less, or because they observe some mitzvot but they have temptations in the particular area they're working in. We spoke about this 2-3 weeks ago. Shul Bear apartment. If it's the particular area that you're working in that you don't observe, So someone who keeps Shabbat, but he's lazy about eating meat, I don't know, I think he's like morbidly obese, has an eating disorder or something. So he eats non-kosher meat every so often, but he keeps Shabbat religiously. So when it comes to meat, you put a mashgiach on him. When it comes to Shabbat, maybe he's trusted where he, does what he does. If you were to prepare me something on Shabbat or heat it up, and I'd say, did you cook this on Shabbat? Did you heat it up? Because we don't know. Shabbat I observe. Okay, so I probably believe it. When it comes to non-Jews, they tend not to have much by way of halachic grace, and we would just assume that they are insensitive to or don't care about the halakhah. A little bit of discretion. But when someone says to you something totally innocently, unless he or she is trying to push a product, and again, this is a non-Jew. A non-Jew comes and tells me, guess what? I produce cheeses, but my cheeses are all natural. I don't use any animal ingredients. They may or may not know about the enzymes in the stomach, etc. The rennet, how they produce the cheese, but it can be done in more than one way, either vegetarian sourced or from animal enzymes. So if someone were to come and tell you this, he or she is trying to sell cheese that may or may not be kosher, here you might ask yourself some questions. Someone observant comes out and says, here, I produce cheese, you're allowed to eat from it. If you end up on a farm, there's a Jewish guy who happens to have a cow and wants to milk it for you, and there's no isur, you don't require hashgacha beyond this. It's Chalev Yisrael because he's Jewish, not because someone's standing there and saying it's Chalev Yisrael. Important concepts to know and to grasp. When it comes to packaged foods, okay? And by the way, what's the oldest example of packaged food? The oldest packaged food around.
Well, bread, probably.
Who packages bread, huh?
Flour.
Who packages flour? Back in the day, you went to you brought your own bag, or you bought it with utensils that were of a certain size. Oh, come on, guys. Food that always was and can only be sold in a package.
Oh, man.
No, wine. How do you get wine? It comes in the bottles. You could bring your own bottles. They used to do that. When they opened a keg of wine, they opened a barrel of wine, people used to come with their own pitchers or jugs, and you would pay based on how much it was that you took. But wine itself, if it was in a barrel or in a bottle, okay, the Gemara says, how do we handle things that are packaged? Does it constantly need to be supervised? So in the case of wine, we have a peculiar sensitivity. Maybe we should talk about wine in general and its status, not necessarily tonight, but at some point it's kedai, because this is a big chunk of why there is hashgacha on a lot of things. Anything that has grapes or grape juice or flavor or must extract or crème de tartare, there's 1,000 different products that are produced from grapes. They're exceptionally sweet as far as fruits go. The sugars themselves are fairly complex, and therefore they're useful for a bunch of different processes. They use the grape skins for color, just like it gives color to wine, they can give color to other products. Products that have nothing to do with grapes, and they can be synthesized or refined sugar, but they'll sometimes get the color from the grape skins. So, because we had a suspicion, at least in antiquity, that non-Jews, when they see wine, they pour libations. Before drinking, they would tip a little to their gods, or pour it, or spritz it, or whatever. Incidentally, this is probably the root of the concept of what they call in English christening a boat, where you inaugurate a boat the first time that a boat is actually deposited in water and set out to sail. They would break a bottle over it, of wine or champagne or something.
Yeah, I've seen that.
Might be a particularly Italian thing, but
No, French do it as well.
The French
baptize it.
Oh, baptize. Well, okay, that's that's
Same
any
concept.
doubts that you might have had about it. Yeah,
Or
in
is
English
it
they
allowed
would
to
say
do that? I buy a
christening.
boat.
Huh?
If I buy a boat, not allowed to do that.
It's profoundly idolatrous.
Yeah, that's what I'm
It's,
thinking.
yes. So you call it baptizing. That makes a lot of sense. In English they call it christening, which is
It's the same
effectively the same. Yeah, with christening with a T.
Okay.
Like Christ.
Yeah, great.
So the practice itself is idolatrous, but this is how they used to inaugurate, initiate expensive, valuable items that they cared about. So because the suspicion was that if they're drinking it for themselves or mixing it for themselves or whatever they did with wine, they did somehow with the intention to use it in some form of worship, or at least to give a quick libation to the gods before you drink for yourself. We suspect we were not allowed to handle kosher wine. They might shake it or move it, etc. And even they would just shake the bottle sometimes for the sake of the gods and drink if they were cheap. with pouring it. But when it comes to the production of wine, as long as there are Jews there supervising, making sure that nothing is being used for other purposes, generally speaking, it's okay. Not everybody who handles it is Jewish. And once the wine is stored, here the Gemara says if the casks are sealed, it's enough that you have a mishgiach nichnas v'yotze. Right? It's enough that I have a mishgiach who comes and goes. Not if the wine is owned by a Jew, not if the wine is owned or produced by someone else. Only when I have the suspicion that a non-Jewish idolater is going to be tinkering with it. Incidentally, the Arizal, of all people, Chaim Vital tells of him that he used to buy grape juice that was squeezed by the Muslims who are not Jewish. Why is this? Because he said the Muslims don't worship Avodah. Wine doesn't figure anywhere in their religion when it comes to pouring libations to gods. So I allow myself to drink from them. And as a Kabbalist, and he was more lenient in this than any other rabbi in his generation, but there's a rationale behind it.
But you don't hold this way now.
Today,
I
you
know
will
there are leniency
typically
with
not
Muslims.
find, you will not find places
that
that permit
lenient.
Muslims, for example, to pour wine for Jews in restaurants, things like that. If it was cooked, that's a separate story. I would be shocked. That's done in order to ruin the taste. So, when it comes to packaged goods, the Gemara says that when can you leave wine with a non-Jew or deliver it by a non-Jew? Think about that. What if I want to sell cases of wine or I sell by the bottle and I have somebody traveling or helping me? So here the Gemara says that if it's sealed chotam, betoch chotam, if it has two seals on it, it's okay. So if the bottle has a cork in it, these are actually discovered much later than corks. Don't put it on, in fact, it was in the first one. But if the bottle was sealed somehow with leather, it was tied, or there was something else forced stuff into it. So as long as there were two seals on it, two seals might be leather with a string, it might be a cork with wax on top of it. Today they put the corks and they have the plastic or foil that goes on top of it. And then we don't suspect that the goyim would open the bottle in order to molest the wine that's in it in the name of Avodah Zarah. Why is this? Because it would be too hard to counterfeit, too hard to falsify the bottle, what they call tamper-evident packaging today. So because it's really hard to put the cork in the first place, you take out the cork, it's almost impossible to put back around right machinery or equipment. So why would anybody go to the trouble? If the bottle was a simple screw-on, screw-off cap, okay. Today we have the tamper-evident ones. Here comes the question. How many layers of packaging do you need? Generally speaking, if it's packaging that's difficult to replicate, we're okay with one. So cheese is sold in vacuum-packed pouches. It looks like they have air in them, it's actually gas. They used to prevent it from going funky, losing its color from sticking, because if you vacuum pack it too tight, it gets squished. So it comes vacuum packed. There's a sticker on it that says that it's under Hashgacha. Technically, anybody can print a sticker, but technically that's illegal. In fact, we live in a country in which if you falsely advertise a product and being something that's not, you're liable to be prosecuted. So because cheese isn't quite as sensitive as wine is, wine it's enough that a non-Jew touched it in order it becomes problematic according to Halakhah as traditionally practiced. We'll discuss this some other time. So in a situation like this, one package is enough. One packaging, I should say, is enough. There are places, for example, some traditional butcher shops, that when they package meat, they'll wrap it twice. The traditional, like, styrofoam tray, how traditional styrofoam, 30 years, but okay. They take these foam trays and they put plastic over them. Some of the more Haredi supermarkets will actually put 2 layers of plastic wrap over it. For the simple reason that they want to, again, a chotam is like 2 layers, one packaging inside another, which makes it much more difficult to falsify or to When it comes to basar shetanami na'ayim, just to note on this, things that disappeared from your view. Today, most poskim hold. This was a discussion that we brought up in Rav Moshe's psak by drinking milk that was not under constant rabbinic supervision. That if you work in a slaughterhouse, for example, today, I mean, you get irradiated when you're going in and out these days. You have to be clean, you have to wear a new coat every time you walk in, you have to change your gloves, you have to change the hairnet and the beard net. So there's no way that you can bring meat from the outside. So if the doors are being observed, and probably even if the doors are under video surveillance, that might be enough in order to prevent anybody from trying to bring non-kosher meat in and then selling it at the kosher premium.
Yeah, but what about mixing up between the trefa and in a kosher animal.
That's a function of what happens on the ground in the slaughterhouse itself, and for this they use stamps.
Yeah, that's,
Which is interesting, by the way, because the stamp is really only, it's not even a packaging, it's just a sign. But the Gemara has a lot of examples of this. When they do get erased very easily. In fact, when the carcasses hit each other, sometimes they're still warm and they're still moist and just smeared and you can't read it. But they put stamps on them and so it does. It is what it is.
well,
Ask me how I know.
you just have to go. You'll have just anything you need, and you'll be fine.
Well, the Gemara talks about what they used to do is they would actually cut the meat in certain places. So how would you know if I was sending meat from the kosher butcher shop with a non-Jewish employee to to the home of one of my customers? So they would cut the meat. They would make there's a certain number of cuts. Incidentally, by the Ashkenazim, they have a big taboo against making an X on the meat because that was the traditional sign. Not certainly because of the cross. That was the traditional sign that it was tarif. So in the slaughterhouse, if someone actually cuts an X, scratches an X onto a carcass or onto a piece of meat, they would assume that it's to indicate that it was a tarif. You have to be. They would suspect, unless it was clear that someone made a mistake, that this would be the case. But because it's so hard to get animals in and out of a slaughterhouse today, they're under so much control and so much supervision. We rely on the stamp system, which means that even after the shochet goes home, nobody's standing there staring at these things. Doesn't happen. Maybe really weird people would do that, but not normal people. Normal people, you process a certain number of animals on that day, you put a stamp, and then you leave. And you assume that the stamp says what it needs to say. Is it possible to falsify? Absolutely. It has happened. One C situation is one example. But at the risk of making halakhah impossibly expensive or impossible to abide by, we rely on chazakot. Normally it doesn't happen. Most places are careful and conscientious. And the people who cheat are an aberration. They're not the norm, they're the exception. But that's an example of a situation where because the doors are more or less supervised, the product itself is more or less supervised, we have to assume that there's a chance that someone falsifying would be caught. And if not, we assume that people are operating in good faith until we hear otherwise. It's not very healthy for the soul to assume that everyone's trying to cheat you or rip you off. Nobody can be trusted. We've had this discussion before. Just putting that out there. But yeah, generally speaking, today we tend to hold by one seal on a product. If it's a pasta sauce, if it's cheese, if it's milk, if it's meat. The products are relatively closely controlled. The government does punish for falsification and counterfeit and false advertising, so it makes halakhah a little bit easier in the sense that we live in an organized country. You don't need to go to the same lengths they had to in antiquity, like making cuts and secret signs on things in order to indicate that it was kosher. We'll wrap this up with God's help next week, and we'll take another last portion from Eshet Chai with God's help before we go on hiatus.